Hello and welcome to the Shiki Science Show, where today I'm joined by Sho Joseph Ozaki Tan, founder of the Public Longevity Group. This group is a platform dedicated to unlocking public understanding and trust around longevity science by mapping sentiment, risk signals, and cultural narratives. Here we discuss what this all means for the future of longevity and how public trust, not just scientific progress, might be the real breakthrough needed to bring these advances to society. So I brought you on today to talk about the Public Longevity Group, or PLG, I think is probably easier for us to say. And I guess my first question is, what exactly is the problem that the Public Longevity Group is trying to solve?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a goalpost that I think that not many other longevity organizations or efforts that are currently targeting right now. Is that we always try to emphasize that we want to target this bottleneck that we call public trust, right? We believe that this metric that I think most people don't really hit is something that's really, really necessary for almost any kind of movement out there, and longevity is not exactly an exception to this. If you're talking about like climate change movement, any kind of political movement, it more or less depends how much resources you can get, how much talent you attract, how much money you can get, how much political backing you can get. Depends on how well you convince the people around you that whatever you're doing is good for just society in general, as probably as long as you live in a democracy. And yeah, so we want to, longevity is still a fairly niche topic, although it's starting to win over the public little by little. But sometimes it's a really, really tough sell, and there's a lot of surveys to show that. Not too many people know this, but there have been some academic efforts in order to understand how people think about longevity, how much they trust longevity, and historically it's not been super, super good. And our job is to change that, basically, using rigorous data. That's essentially the principal idea of Public Longevity Group. Yeah.
So one thing that I kept coming across in your documentation is this phrase, cultural intelligence. And I suppose I don't fully understand what that is, but it seems very important to what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about cultural intelligence, or just maybe we can just begin with while we talk about culture in general. Well, one of the goals that PLG has set for itself is that we want to essentially make longevity part of the public consciousness, like basically part of public culture in a sense. We want longevity to be something that is embraced by society, generally speaking. So that's what it means to be part of the culture. So, for example, let's say here, the idea of living longer or aging is something that's in Japan, perhaps is a really good tangent here. It's that it's always part of the public consciousness mind that people are getting older. Like pensions. There's always a pension pressure. There's always like healthcare pressure because of an aging population. So solutions are always bugging people. Like people want to know what can be done. And in that sense, there's kind of a consciousness about aging. And I'm hoping for something similar, I suppose, in the rest of the world. Like people want to, I'm hoping that people understand the aging and longevity movement in a sense, and agree that living better longer is something that's beneficial for most societies around the world. And by being embedded in the culture, it means that you've gained the trust of whatever society that you try to manage to convince, in a sense, right? And that's what I mean essentially by the cultural part of it. And when I talk about intelligence, it's basically having a really, really good quantitative feedback system of how this culture is changing over time. So if we want to look at longevity specifically, we want to understand, all right, like how often do people interact with this concept longevity online or the day-to-day? Do they search for it more often? What do they write about it? And this is again taking advantage of sentiment in that sense. We want to be able to track how people understand longevity or interact with longevity longitudinally, so that we essentially have a feedback system for the rest of the longevity community or any of the longevity orgs on how well they're doing to spread their message. In essence, yeah.
Yeah, I see. And so I think you kind of already led on to my next question, which is, well, how exactly are you planning to get this data, and how are you planning to use it to understand the cultural intelligence of the longevity space?
Yeah, there's many different ways that we're doing it. So, of course, culture is very multidimensional. You can't just rely on a single data source or platform in order to do it. But we have a couple of bread and butter efforts, although we are trying to spread ourselves as much as possible, realistically possible, to try to capture as much of the full picture as we can. So one really quick, not quick, I would say, but like a couple of good ways that we're doing it, first and foremost, is internet scraping. Like, we just go on the largest data set in the world is the internet, right? Basically, and everybody is talking about longevity every day, all around the world, and we want to understand how people are doing that, basically. So the easiest thing for us to look at is things like Reddit, things like X, or LinkedIn, or 4chan even, and see what the discourse around longevity is, and try to quantify that. So how often are people speaking about longevity? In what way are they doing it? What kind of people are speaking about longevity? Like in this, we can also, because the way that X and like Reddit are set up, if people talk about a particular topic, like if they talk about longevity, they're bound to be talking about other kind of things. So we can also identify things like tangential interests. So that's one thing. Another thing is we can also track popular media attitudes. Like, we're talking about like BBC, New York Times, Daily Mail. Like, we can go all the way from like really established media all the way to the most niche article producers. So there's many different ways that the popular media infrastructure interact with the general public, and they also define quite heavily how the public sees longevity and what it stands for, right? So we definitely want to have a really, really good way of understanding how big news outlets see us, what kind of opinions they're producing, the quality of these articles, how well informed they are, as well as really important. Actually, here's a pretty interesting one. In the UK, the Daily Mail is the most largest producers of longevity articles, like on average, even more than The Economist, basically more than The Guardian. Essentially, it's probably the top 3 in the world, even for English speaking, I think. So that's an interesting tidbit there. And of course, like, Daily Mail has one of the highest readerships of any news outlets anywhere. So so when people interact with longevity, they'll see like whatever their headlines is, and sensationalism definitely has its impact on whatever industry or community or movement, right? And that's also kind of like something we want to take into account, like what risks are there in a sense. So those two things. But there's still quite a lot more. We also plan to run like surveys as well to target specific interest groups. So in a sense, we want to understand like what are the demographics of people who are interested in longevity or not interested in longevity. We also want to understand the psychology behind it as well. Like, are longevity interests kind of a crossover with particular personality types? Like, we have looked at Big Five data, Big Five personality data, happiness data, and that kind of thing. And also, we also want to look at regionally what kind of places tend to foster longevity interest, right? We also want to see, okay, are these places tend to be more wealthier, more educated? Do they tend to vote a particular way as well? So there's a lot of different kinds of breadths and depths in terms of metrics that we can look at to get a really as full as a picture as possible as what the public believe and think and interact with the idea of longevity, that produces a really good, let's say, a feedback system for the rest of the community to really pay attention to about what works and what doesn't work in terms of communication. Right? Yeah, that's the way. That's how we're thinking about it in a sense.
Yeah, I think I understand. And of course, as you mentioned, it's not trivial to define something like culture. And so you do need various different sources. And I know at the moment, primarily you've just been using internet-based data. And I've had a look at some of your outputs. And so far, you've done a nice sort of overview specifically with the US, looking at which states have more interest in longevity, and identified certain groups of people who are perhaps the early adopters to understanding or accepting this concept of longevity. So could you elaborate more on these early findings that you've already made?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is part of our preliminary report. This is like the first few tidbits of data that we were happy with publishing and showing the rest of the longevity community. We principally focused on the United States simply because they have the loudest longevity community in the world, like, as a single nation, right? And they also have the most amount of data points. So essentially what we've done is we tried to track search interest. One of our key data points is like the particular search interest around the country, how interested people are on the internet about particularly longevity topics. So we don't just look at the word longevity, we also look at things like health span, senescence, what else is there, like like David Sinclair's book, or like Brian Johnson or Aubrey or whoever. We try to track a holistic kind of search data in a sense, to understand where longevity is strong and where longevity is weak around the country, and we try to do that at state level. So what we've found is that particular states tend to have really high longevity interests, and while other states tend to have really, really low ones. So if I remember correctly, the strongest performing states were California, Massachusetts, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, that kind of thing. So mostly West Coast states, although there's quite a bit of prominence in the Northeast as well, with some huge gaps in the Midwest and the South. So once we understand that, we can also cross-reference with US Census data to understand, okay, what are the kind of demographics that we want to, what are the kind of demographics that tend to inhibit these regions, and we can cross-reference that with interest, right? And what we've discovered is that there's a particular pattern. In a sense, older, more educated, happier, wealthier, more well-insurance people, on average, tend to be more interested in longevity, which is kind of like maybe a kind of expected result, right? If, of course, like almost anecdotally speaking, almost every single academic conference or fellowship that I've been a part of tends to be, the people who tend to fill this space tends to be of that particular group, right? In a sense. While on the other hand, we find big gaps in like Midwestern or Southern regions, and when we cross-reference that with American Census data, we tend to see more conservatives, less conservatives being represented, people who are less wealthy, less educated, just everything on the opposite scale of things. So in that sense, that just means that the idea of longevity, and its narratives tend to cluster towards, I said, these really, I think wealth is a really good indicator. These wealthier regions, these more educated regions, these older regions, and these more liberal regions as well. Actually, that has to be said. It tend to be where these ideas tend to cluster, and so. But the problem is that America is a really, really big place, and so is the rest of the world. Like, that specific interest group is a very, very small subset of the rest of the public. And so we need to do a better job at being able to convince the rest of the country that this is something that's really worthwhile, that this living better longer shouldn't just be for, the people living in the city or the urban life or whatever. Um, it's something that's a public good for everybody, right? I think everybody in the longevity movement, nobody would say that this wasn't essentially a public good enterprise. We hope that the rest of the country or the rest of the world would also come to believe that living longer is a good thing. That living longer better is a good thing, right? And in that sense, we identify the gaps of where longevity doesn't do super well, and our major task is coming up with new communication strategies that can target these regions. For example, we know that how do I say? We know that more conservative regions are not super on board with longevity. Perhaps there's kind of a conservative leading narrative that we can lean into, or we know that older people, mostly older people, it's a very clear line. Mostly older people tend to be interested in the idea of longevity and lifespan extension. Perhaps there are narratives that work really, really well catered to younger people, that don't really resonate with that don't resonate with the current crowd, but will work really well with the younger people. And we're taking advantage of marketing tools such as A/B testing, for example, in order to understand what's the best strategy that works there. So yeah, we're trying to turn communication into a science, in a sense. So we want to optimize particular messaging towards very, very targeted to specific groups. Targeted to very, very specific groups, and take advantage of the entire ecosystem of what makes up America, for example. Yeah, maybe that's a quick overview of what we've been able to accomplish. We've also been able to have kind of a sentiment analysis machine where, as I mentioned, we can take advantage of I think we reported on Reddit, and we mostly focused on Reddit's longevity discourse. So there's many, many different subreddits on longevity, like our longevity, our Brian Johnson, our blueprint, that kind of thing. And we can essentially compare how people talk about longevity in these longevity communities, like these dozens and dozens of longevity subreddits, and compare that with, something like a more vanilla longevity, a vanilla subreddit, something like our Ask, like our news, subreddits where people just generally will gravitate towards, no matter what kind of person they are, what political leaning they have, what age group they are, they will naturally gravitate towards these subreddits. And then we can compare those two to see how people are talking about longevity, what their sentiment behind it is, and we can see there's a really big gap. Of course, most people in the longevity community are going to be much more enthusiastic about longevity, while the general public is, less enthusiastic, more skeptical, that kind of thing. We also do the same thing for our media articles, looking at how these longevity media, not longevity, these popular media news outlets discuss longevity in a sense, and we can also keep track the sentiment and the sentiment of a whole bunch of longevity articles, as well as the longevity discourse on Reddit as well, amongst the longevity subreddits against the more vanilla public oriented subreddit, and we've been able to collect that once and give a snapshot to the longevity community. But from there onwards, we want to be able to do this constantly, right? Longitudinally, so we can see how public opinion is shifted basically week by week. And this is kind of information that the longevity community needs to know in order to improve our current standing within the general public, right? To track how essentially we are doing. I think that basically covers what we've basically reported on. More data to come. Maybe I can quickly share about our next a quick project. We'll be sharing our data soon. Of course, we are doing the exact same thing for Twitter, but Twitter is quite a much larger discourse space than even something like Reddit, and it provides like really um, unique insights, especially on what kind of person is being involved in longevity. For example, we can take into account like where they're from, because that's reported in many accounts. Reddit doesn't really do that. Not many other platforms actually do that. Where they're from, what particular movement, what particular kind of movement or interest adjacent space that they're part of, like they always say it in their bio or something like that. But yeah, like that Twitter is our next major focus, and we're almost done with it, and we're going to be announcing that quite soon, and on the probably when this video comes up. And another thing is that we want to be able to describe, we want to be able to analyze popular media moments about longevity. When I talk about that, I mean, like, for example, just a couple of weeks back, maybe about a month back at this point, there was a moment when Xi Jinping discussed like organ transplant and like the possibility of significant life extension to like 150 years, if I remember the quote correctly. And there was a lot of media debate around it. Of course, major news outlets picked up on it, as well as the experts and the Redditverse. And we also wanted to understand what the major public reaction to that was, right? So we can basically report on these high-profile moments to give feedback to the rest of the community about what went well and what didn't went well, right? How did this particular movement move the needle in terms of public opinion towards longevity and life extension? Yeah. So of course, these things have really big implications, because these naturally will go towards how politicians perceive longevity and life extension technology when such a high-profile thing happens, and that will naturally translate into how how much research funding goes into this kind of thing. For example, how regulations would change. For example, right? Public optics are super important in a democracy, in a sense, right? We need to convince these people and these politicians that this is a good idea in order to produce change, and this is naturally a part of that. Yeah.
Yes, I think. Yeah, you've raised many points there, and I probably have many follow-up questions, but I think I can try and summarize it into a more concise question, which is that you claim that what you're trying to do with the PLG is kind of very unique and that no one's really done this before. And of course, I think you mean not specifically in longevity, but regarding other topics, whether it's AI or other very important cultural talking points. And so why do you think that is? And is it because what you're doing is actually quite difficult, and the amount of data you can collect through the internet, like how trustworthy is it? Can we really use that data reliably? Can we trust that it's not just all bots or AI generated information? And then, so I guess, my question is, why do you think no one's done this before?
Yeah, I will try to tackle that one by one, in a sense. So let's see here. Whether why we're unique, basically. Yeah, we are basically the first kind of data science, scientific communication data intelligence machine that we can give feedback to the rest of the community. We're not like we're definitely the first in the longevity community as far as I'm aware, but we're not the first when it comes to movements in general. I do believe that there are big companies that are actually dedicated to this kind of thing called like Data for Progress, or there's a bunch of other politically aligned like think tanks, I think. So for example, these companies, what they do is, if a politician like um, Bernie Sanders has a kind of policy that, for example, that they want to push uh, through their legislature, they won't just do that immediately. Their team will collaborate with one of these political think tanks in order to assess how robust this policy is and what the feedback is amongst like the public. So they will also take into account how well these policies do amongst like particular interest groups that they want to target, and if there's any way that this could provide any backlash politically or socially, etc. And then, once this data is compiled, this will be given back to Bernie Sanders' team, and they will reevaluate their policy and their wording, etc., so that they can basically give it their best shot when they put it before Congress, right? In that sense, we're sort of emulating them. We want to be able to use longevity community as the concept that we take in. We analyze the rest of the public, what they think, what can be optimized, what can be changed, and then we give it back to the rest of the community so that they can improve their image, they can improve their optics, they can improve the kind of the ways that they communicate, and in that way, produce bigger wins when it comes to winning public trust, right? So I think that answers the first part of your question. The second part is about how trustworthy this data is. So, of course, as you mentioned, like things like bots, constant spammers are a massive concern. Just to recently share about, we're in the middle of the project for X, for example, and X is crawling with bots. And I think it's also part of like Twitter itself. Like there's it's naturally almost sort of embedded within it. And this is especially important when it comes to like a crypto discourse. I mean, there's a bunch of DAOs that are involved in the longevity space at this point, for better, I think, in many ways, in that it produces like capital for funding. It's kind of like a natural funding mechanism for longevity efforts. But at the same time, it kind of like it's kind of like a huge advertisement for social media, oftentimes. But what's really, really good nowadays is that with the rise of LLMs, for example, filtering these out has never been easier, fortunately. Of course, I'm not going to say that there are no caveats. And in fact, we oftentimes, in our analysis, we often treat it as a feature, not a bug. So what kind of spamming occurs is also kind of a signal that we also would like to take into account, because that's spamming is kind of an irritant online, and seeing people's natural reaction to that is also part of public trust. If something is super spammy, if something is like, for example, like something like is super like close to how people perceive something like NFTs or BitConnect or whatever, people are just not going to trust that. And that's something we have to keep our finger on as well. So, oftentimes when we just want to understand how people discuss longevity, we can filter it out at a high volume quite well. While at other times, depending on analysis that we want to do, we also want to capture that and make it a part of the analysis to see how people respond to these kind of advertisements, and who are the people behind these kind of spammy advertisements, who are making these bots. Because it's also true, the longevity space on X and Reddit definitely has its own share of like advertisements when it comes to this pill is going to make you younger by 20 years, and it's just some kind of like cosmetic pill or something that's completely unproven. And that's a major red flag, because surveys do show already that people kind of are skeptical about what longevity brings, and like the fact that it feels scammy and snake oily just naturally means that people are not going to trust it very much. And in the journey towards building public trust, this is something that has to be addressed and dealt with promptly by the rest of the community as well, and that's what we believe. Yeah. Did I answer all parts of your question? Am I missing one bit or more?
No, I think you think you did a very good job. As in, you already sort of raised the next question, which is the one part I didn't think I fully understand is, once you collect this data, how exactly do you intend to implement it and make changes? So change public perception and the culture around longevity?
Yeah. So again, we do have kind of a suite of marketing tools that we can use. Of course, I think I'm just gonna go back and default. Like our bread and butter is for sure going to be A/B testing. Like just understanding how different people at a high volume react to different kind of communication, bits in a sense. So a really, really easy one is like, okay, what do people feel about the word longevity versus health span versus lifespan extension? You know, that whole debate. We believe that we can actually solve that quite quickly in terms of perception by putting that in front of the public and asking them specifically which one they think is better and why, or like which context is this better and where, right? And we can divide that up and provide a really comprehensive response that we can repackage and provide to the rest of the community. So that's just one tidbit. Of course, this can be elevated into higher order communication bits and strategies as well. For example, what kind of narrative is most attractive? So what we've done is we've basically identified 5 major longevity narratives based on looking at how people search for longevity online. So looking at the particular words and the particular volume of the words, we've sort of empirically discovered what are the major ways that 5 major ways that people interact with longevity online. So these include things like, we named them ourselves, but we called them like mind healer, like body hacker, like medical strategist. You know, these all represent particular flavors of longevity. So, for example, like medical strategist is really institutional. We're talking about like NIA, NIH, Judith Campisi, TAME trial, like the really, really institutional, like scientifically backed stuff. And for example, when people go and look at academic articles around longevity, that's one way that they see it, right? Another way is like body hacking, for example, like actually trying to change like their body parts or like optimize their biology through bioengineering in some way. This is definitely perhaps like niche generally, but it's definitely kind of a prevalent narrative that occurs within the longevity space. And essentially what we can do is we can have different flavors of these narratives, put it in front of people and say, okay, which one do you prefer and why? And then we can essentially discover, again, like through profiling their demographics, their psychographics, to be able to deeply understand where do these narratives resonate and why do they resonate. But also we are going to be working with other longevity orgs and also internally as well in order to come up with new longevity narratives. So I said we've already discovered ones that exist and we more or less know where they do well and where they don't do well. But again, we notice a really common trend that they tend to aggregate around the same areas, like at the same regions, same demographics. Again, wealthier populations, more educated, more better insured. But now is the time for us to come up with new narratives that appeal, new narratives about longevity that will appeal to like the demographics that we are basically unable to touch until now. So perhaps a more patriotic narrative that we can experiment with, or something that screams youth more. There's a lot of ways that we experiment with this and come up with basically novel ideas on how to engage these unengaged populations, right? And in that sense, it's basically a game of risk that we want to spread our influence in a way that is more, like trying to expand more and more and more until this is something that's within the public consciousness in a really good way, right? I think, longevity is definitely a concept that has that's unripe in the mind of the public. It could go well, it could go badly. It's our job as a community to make sure that we do it in a really healthy manner, right? And win public trust very robustly. And I think that will mean the best outcome for the longevity movement. It means that we get the right infrastructure for the most accessibility, the best infrastructure for the biotech companies that are being involved, most amount of funding, largest market reach, the best infrastructure for other longevity advocacy groups that are also working really hard in order to capture public trust, right? So this is kind of a holistic effort in a sense. We can apply ourselves in many, many, many different areas and hopefully provide wins in all those areas as well, right?
Yeah, I see, and I agree that I think public trust is, of course, very important, especially for something like longevity, which in theory should have global benefits if the big if we find something that can truly work. And so I suppose, that raises the point that you're building the infrastructure to improve public understanding, education, to ultimately give them trust in what this longevity movement is. But what if, let's say, we don't find any longevity therapeutic or anything that will work robustly, or if there is negative news or some therapy didn't work very well? Like in these hypothetical situations, I guess my question is more the bottleneck. Do you think it's about the public perception, or do you think it's still the bottleneck, of course, is more at the research level, like actually trying to find the solution to this longevity?
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good way to answer your question. What PLG aims to do is basically to dissociate the longevity movement's success with its ability to consistently produce like wins in research and clinical trials, because the nature of that is that it's risky, and of course we're not like ultra well funded compared to something like cancer. Like we haven't won the narrative like cancer or diabetes has done. And so essentially, at least from our perspective, there's always a risk that we won't be able to produce like the longevity pill or like the big research win that the public expects of us. In the sense, we don't want to be dependent on hype cycling, right? People were really hyped for like metformin or like rapamycin or whatever, and there's always a chance that it just doesn't work and people get exhausted with what we stand for. When I talk about integrating longevity with culture, that's independent. It means that what I mean is that I want people to actively desire it, to actively believe that it's something that's good for society, that something needs to be changed, societally, politically, economically, it's something that needs to be addressed. And that is kind of the groundwork that needs to be set in order to produce these successes. Because longevity and aging is a really, really complicated topic. I think it's arguable that it's essentially on the scale of like cancer, or maybe even more in terms of complexity. I mean, as a biologist yourself, you can weigh in on that. But it's not an easy problem, and the amount of capital that we're getting relative to whether we can solve it super, super robustly is kind of contentious. Of course, there is a chance that a home run could be hit within like the next 5 years. I'm not going to discount that, but I'm trying to say that we don't want to bet on that. Like we don't want to bet the house on that. And so what that means is we need to make it so that we're not reliant on something that is based on outcomes. For example, like through the climate change movement, they're not necessarily based on success of, like an annual success of removing carbon from the atmosphere, like particular percent, or some kind of other technological victory or political victory. People just want to see a greener world from their perspective. And so that's what we want from the rest of the public as the longevity movement. People have to actively desire the idea of living longer, better. And that is not something we're seeing right now, as far as we can tell. But that is the victory that we want to bring as the public longevity group, right? I think that's the kind of perspective that we have on that. Did I make it understandable somewhat?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think it also in my brain sort of I see it more as like a cycle, right? That if, as I say, the bottlenecks in longevity is more the research or the funding for the research, etc., then having better public perception can perhaps increase funding into research, increase more researchers going into research, and then that in itself creates a sort of hopefully a positive cycle. But you can see it being very beneficial for the field. So yeah, I guess as a sort of closing note, like for my viewers who want to have a look at some of these early reports that you've been producing, like where can I direct them to, or where can I learn more about what PLG is trying to do?
Yeah, currently, we are we're currently being incubated by the Lifespan Research Institute. So we are running a fundraising campaign to support our basically our activities. We've got a lot of things planned, but you can learn more by clicking on this link in this URL. It's lifespan.io/PLG campaign. Hopefully it'll be in, we'll send it over to you as well. And you can learn all about us. We also have our resources. Feel free to reach out to me personally as well at show@lifespan.io. We're always willing to have a talk. We're in the middle of negotiating some specific consulting partnerships with a couple of major longevity organizations as well, so that we can help them achieve their goals too. So please support us. We really want to see this project come to life, and we want to be a force that's very consistent for the longevity community, and make sure that we can bring it home for the entire ecosystem. We don't want to be specific to just one part of the longevity, one aspect of longevity. We want to be able to produce these wins for essentially everybody, and hopefully a brighter future for all. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. No, it was really refreshing to have this discussion about not just specifically the science, but the other cultural aspects that, of course, is impacted by longevity research. So I think it is a very important topic. And yeah, of course, I'm interested to see some of the outputs from your group. So yeah, thank you. It was a good conversation.
Appreciate it.